All right, welcome everyone to today's Q&A webinar on back to work strategies for safely resuming operations and protecting your workforce during this coronavirus pandemic. I'm Andrea Lanza, Director of Corporate Operations at Princeton Longevity Center. And joining me today is Dr. Miles Varn, Chief Executive Officer of PinnacleCare Health Advisory. And we're both excited for you to join us today. As difficult as it was to shut down operations 3 months ago, companies are finding the task of returning to the workplace in some ways even more challenging. As a leader in preventive medicine and executive health, Princeton Longevity Center has partnered with our trusted friends at PinnacleCare Health Advisory to answer the many questions we are receiving from our clients on best practices for a safe return back to the workplace. PinnacleCare is one of the country's leading health advisory firms, connecting their clients with access to the world's best medical experts and healthcare options available. With a team of experts in immunology and epidemiology at their fingertips, they are providing thought leadership, actionable data, and expert consultations on COVID-19 through their pandemic response program. Dr. Varn will spend the majority of our time today answering the most frequent questions Princeton Longevity has received on returning to the workplace safely, and he will also take time at the conclusion of our discussion to answer questions you have on both best practices as well as general COVID-19 health, safety, and research questions. At this time, I would like to invite you to start sending those questions using the Q&A button on your Zoom toolbar. Please feel free to continue to send questions throughout the webinar, and we will try to get to as many as possible after our presentation concludes. To use the Q&A function, click the Q&A button at the top of your screen or in your Zoom toolbar, enter your question into the text box, and click Send. If you see another question posted that you would also like to hear answered, please click the like button rather than submitting that question again. Also keep in mind that although today's audience is primarily attendees in the human resources and health and benefits arena, today's questions will focus solely on the health aspect of coronavirus and not necessarily issues around human resources office policy. We also ask that if you have questions on how Princeton Longevity Center or PinnacleCare can help support your offices, please direct those questions after the webinar by email to webinar@princetonlongevity.info or visit our websites for more information. With that being said, it is my pleasure to now welcome Dr. Miles Varn to our Q&A. Dr. Varn, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Andrea. I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to join all of you today from your homes, I assume, to talk to you a little bit about back to work issues in COVID.
Excellent. So I think to get things started, I think most people are familiar with the basics of COVID-19, but can you give us an update on what are the most important things we should know at this point?
Yeah, we've certainly learned a great deal. One of the things we learned in the very beginning is that we were woefully unprepared in terms of testing, PPE, therapeutics, and really just what worked and didn't work. So I think we've come a long way in that regard. The testing issues are slowly but surely being resolved, and that there's more availability in different ways. And also the PPE issues, particularly for the healthcare workers, are being resolved such that they do have available supplies and they are protected. Some of the things that might be useful that we've learned is that face masks do slow the spread of the virus. Social distancing works well. Some of the more extreme measures, the home lockdowns, allowed us to flatten the curve, which was an important part of sort of learning and then getting to the point where we could manage this as a disease, as a society. So, as it stands now, I think most of you know, just about every state is out of lockdown mode. Some states more so than others, sooner than others. We know that there are hotspots are rising in Florida and Arizona and Texas, where the number of cases is at record levels. If you look at the 7-day average in the US as a whole, that average has ticked up now we're almost back to the point where we were in April. So that's sort of the downside. On the plus side, we have the opportunity now to continue some of those measures that we know work, like face masks, like social distancing. We've learned to be smarter about it. And also, there are some therapeutics that at least show promise. And just briefly, remdesivir, which is an antiviral, has shown promise. More recently, dexamethasone, which is a steroid, helps reduce mortality by 40% in sick people. Convalescent antibodies seem to be working, early studies showed. And then monoclonal antibodies, which are synthesized in the lab. Early stage, but they show some impact. And then, we do know that some of the early things like chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine, azithromycin really may make things worse. So we've learned a lot about that. So we still have a long ways to go, but I think, we've at least caught up to some extent on the data side in our knowledge base to make it easier maybe to open society and open workplaces, as long as we do so smartly.
All right, great. Well, thank you for setting the scene for us. So we're going to start with some of the questions that we're getting. And the first I can say is that, we're hearing a lot of information on modes of coronavirus transmission. And we're hearing from our clients who have employees at all stages of concern. Some are not leaving their homes. Some are waiting for days to bring items into their house so that they can be decontaminated. Others are taking no precaution at all. Can you break down the ways that we are most likely to spread the virus and which ways we're least likely to spread the virus?
Yeah, so it's pretty well known now that the primary way of infecting others or being infected are respiratory droplets. There is much less concern about virus on surfaces, except in places like hospital centers that treat a high number of COVID positive patients. So the way we typically are going to get infected is through exposure to someone who is spreading it by sneezing, coughing, speaking loudly, singing. So that's one fact we know. And we know that face masks actually protect you by virtue of that person who has it is less likely to be able to communicate respiratory droplets to you through a mask. Even if it's not an N95 mask, it's going to reduce those droplets. So that's important. The other thing that we know for certain is that indoor close contact is the primary way that the virus is spread. They just released a study that's not been peer reviewed yet, but out of China, they studied 1,200 positive COVID patients and determined that only 2 of those had exposures outside. So 2 out of 1,200 were transmitted outside. All the others were inside. About 80% were transmitted through close household contacts. So meaning, potentially no mask, closer together. And then another 35% were exposed through public transportation. So, if we're thinking smartly, outside's better than inside. Close contact is not a good idea. Face masks are protective. So those are some of the issues in terms of exposure. Some of the least likely ways, not through your grocery bags, not through your clothing in general, not really a risk in terms of outside around runners or around bikers. Singing, loud, particularly indoor activities where you're projecting potentially droplets, that's more of a risk.
Okay, great. That's interesting. Singing loudly. I wouldn't have put that one together, but that does make sense. All right, excellent information. Thank you for that. So another problem facing our clients is business travel. And although we have no idea what the future of business travel looks like, it's certainly changed. But we do assume that some business travel will resume shortly. So some of the questions we're receiving is it safe to fly yet? Is it even safe to, is it safe to stay in a hotel? Is it safe to eat in a restaurant? And do we have to take any additional measures with quarantine for executives who do travel?
So is it safe to fly? It's really kind of a risk-benefit analysis. So I would say if you are an at-risk person, being crowded in a plane where you really can't socially distance, you can wear a mask, you can limit some of the risk, but is it worth that risk? You have to look at your personal situation and decide, is it worth it for me to do that? I think if you choose to fly, there are some things you can do to make it less likely that you'd get infected. Number one is to the extent that you can sit, further away from people. If there's that opportunity in a more open flight with fewer people. Certainly, if you can avoid sitting next to someone, that's better. You definitely want to wear a mask on the plane. No question, that'll help. The CDC recommends that you take sanitizing wipes to wipe down your area of the seat and the tray and anything you might touch. There is a recommendation that you avoid the lavatory if at all possible. And then finally, in terms of beverage service, flights just aren't providing beverage service, but I would think carefully about whether you want to take the beverage service. A lot of flights now are allowing you to actually bring on whatever you want in terms of food or beverage. So that's flying. And in terms of hotels, we know now that surface contamination and exposure in terms of transmission the risk is low. I think most hotels are being fairly neurotic about cleaning the surfaces anyway. I think as long as that's happening, you may want to take some of your own Clorox wipes or other sanitizing materials to do it yourself. But I think the risk is probably fairly low in a hotel. In terms of restaurants, certainly outside, more than 6 feet away is much better. We talked about why outside in general is better. The same applies to restaurants. Inside, it's, your risk is purely related to how close you are and how much time you spend with someone who's infected. And the challenge is, somewhere around 40% of people now are asymptomatic and never have symptoms. And then there's another group that is pre-symptomatic. So, they've got the virus, but they haven't shown any symptoms. So they don't know they're sick. You don't know they're sick. And their highest rate of transmission is about a half day before they actually show symptoms. So indoors at a restaurant, I think, again, if you're in a risk group, I would avoid that. If you're not in a risk group, you really have to balance the risk benefit and the higher likelihood that you could be exposed, even though it certainly is a low percentage that you would pick up the virus in that setting, but it's higher than outside. It's higher than being further away with a mask on. And as far as quarantine, the CDC recommends that if you fly out of the country, that you quarantine yourself for 14 days. And if you look on their site, they have a list of countries, and just about every country on there requires that anyway. They also recommend that you quarantine for 14 days if you're coming in from another country. And even New Zealand, which hasn't seen a case in a week or two, CDC still recommends that if you come into the US from New Zealand, that you self-quarantine for 14 days. So that's a consideration. Are you able to do that? Are you able to stay in your home? Is the trip worth that inconvenience? Maybe it is for some, and maybe it isn't for others.
Okay, super. Thank you for your insight on that. That was, there's some very useful tips in there I think we all could use. So if you could talk a little bit now about best practices for a safe workplace. We're getting quite a few questions on what steps should be taken in office. Now, some of these questions include, should we provide or even require personal protective equipment? Should we do daily health screens for employees? And if so, what are the most effective ways to screen employees? What social distancing measures work? Does plexiglass dividers help to decrease the spread of coronavirus? We've been seeing a lot of those. And what are the most effective cleaning protocols for in office?
So just to start with PPE, if workers cannot socially distance, meaning 6 feet apart, then there is a recommendation that an employer provide PPE, and that may be, factory workers who have to be in close contact, obviously healthcare workers who are exposed to patients and risk exposing patients even without symptoms. Those are really the groups that the CDC is recommending PPE for, not generally otherwise. So in terms of health screenings, they are recommending that, well, first and foremost, that anyone who is sick stays at home, and that's important. I think health screenings are a good way for people to go through the practice every morning or before they go to work of reviewing their symptoms, because it's an expanded list now, and some of them are very non-specific. But if you're going through that checklist every day, then you're much more likely to report something that triggers you to then stay at home to protect everyone else. In terms of social distancing, the CDC recommends that employees, either seated or in their desk space, that they don't share any of their materials. It's also recommended that the desks be reconfigured to be 6 feet apart, and that chairs, in boardrooms or in lounges, be either removed or reconfigured to try to get people more distance. Plexiglass is recommended in cases where you really can't be 6 feet apart. CDC also recommends masks for employees who are working indoors, and then limiting the time in the common areas. So, a break room, you have to limit the number of people, the time people are in there. In bathrooms, there should be some limitations. So some of this is, along the lines of social distancing and common sense along the way. In terms of cleaning protocols, the typical cleaning that a janitorial service does, as long as they do a thorough job, is effective. The only other kind of consideration is, cleaning your own work area when you come in every day. That's a consideration. And then secondly, making sure that the shared spaces, so, a printer, a fax machine, that you have supplies there and that each person cleans the area before and after they use it so that they're protecting themselves and others.
Okay, great, super, that's great. Very helpful. So now we know that not all employees are at the same risk. Some of the questions we've been getting are around high-risk employees. So if you could let us know what makes an employee high risk, what extra precautions should we take for those high-risk employees? Are pregnant staff members considered high risk? And how do we promote health to reduce risk of serious illness?
So high risk is considered, first, age-wise, 65 or older are much more likely to suffer complications, including mortality. This is a disease that, for better or worse, is much more serious for our older friends. People who have cardiovascular disease, like hypertension, or have had a heart attack or have blockages, those people are at risk. People with underlying pulmonary conditions like emphysema or restrictive lung disease, they're more at risk. Immune compromised people are at risk. Pregnant women have not been shown to be more at risk than the general population. So it really just relates to their age. Since most are 40 or under, that's the lowest risk group. It also doesn't seem to have any implications for the baby. There were a number of COVID positive women in China who delivered while they were pregnant, same in the US, and there have been virtually no complications to the baby. So in terms of what do you do if you're high risk, or what do we tell our employees who are in that risk group? We certainly recommend that anyone who's high risk continue to telecommute for the foreseeable future. We're talking about, until a vaccine or widely available therapeutic is out there and used. It's really that group that we're all doing our part to protect. In terms of the face mask, social distancing. This is not a big problem for those who are 40 and under. It is a big problem for that other group. So in our company, we're certainly encouraging them to continue to work remotely from home. The other consideration is, we're saying the same thing for employees who have a high-risk person in their household. They really should consider limiting, their exposure to the outside world, because they're, unfortunately at risk of bringing that home to their household member who isn't quite so fortunate. So that's another consideration. I think awareness is a big thing. Being open and making sure that employees understand that we absolutely encourage them to not come to the office if they have any symptoms, and to provide leave and liberal interpretation, and not necessarily require a doctor's note to come back. So that's what we're doing in our staff. We've limited travel to kind of essential travel. If you can do it by video, that's better. If you need to travel, make sure you take every precaution.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for that. So in this current environment, it's possible that we're going to have at some point an employee show up who is positive. So what kind of, the questions that I'm getting around that tend to be, what are the differences between the coronavirus test? So we know that there's several different tests out there. Which one should we be acting upon for the immediate? How many days until an employee who has tested positive is safe to come back in the office? What measures should be taken if an employee is found to be positive? And does it mean that the whole office needs to quarantine if one employee is found to be positive?
Yeah, these are all important questions. So to start with the tests, so there are two types of tests. One is typically a nasal swab that does a PCR identification of the RNA in the virus and tells you whether you have that viral RNA, and if you do, then presumably you are infected and potentially contagious. The other is a blood test, and the most reliable are venipuncture, not finger blood tests, the vein draws, and those measure antibodies. So if you have IgG antibodies, then presumably you've had the virus and you've recovered, and the assumption is that those antibodies are protective. So let me start with the antibody testing. You'll hear the scientists say, well, there's no proof that these antibodies are protective, and we don't know how long the protection lasts, if it's protective at all. And that's true. There haven't been scientific, well-designed studies to look at that. But if you take the experience from other viruses, it is likely that if you have antibodies, that you are protected. Again, no scientific published proof, but I think it's safe to assume that. Question is, we don't know how long that protection might last. It could be 3 months, it could be 6 months, it could be a year. We do know that typically, looking at other viruses, it'll go down over time. So someone asked the question, if they've had positive antibodies, should they take fewer precautions? They still should, social distance, wear masks. I think they can feel comfortable that they're less likely to either get the virus or transmit it. But there's still, unfortunately, no definitive proof. We may find that question is answered, more in the Asian wave, because they've come before us and now they're, further out, and they'll be able to do more research to look at that question. But it's, it's unanswered at this point. So in terms of coming back to work, so the CDC has two protocols, one that involves testing and one that doesn't. So if you have symptoms that are consistent or potentially consistent, and you isolate at home, then you should isolate until 3 things are met. One, that your respiratory symptoms have to be improving, so your cough, congestion has to be getting better. 2, you have to not have had a fever. A fever is defined as 100.4 or higher, not have had a fever for at least 72 hours. So 3 days without a fever, without being on any antipyretics. And then the third is 10 days had passed from the onset of symptoms to the time when you are able to go back to work. And the reason for the 10 days is they've pretty definitively proven that the risk beyond 8 days of transmitting is almost zero. So that's where they've come up with that guideline. But if you've had a positive test, then the two options are you self-quarantine, stay at home for 10 days after the test was first positive, or as testing becomes more available and some of the rapid tests become available, the recommendation is that you have 2 tests 24 hours or more apart, both negative. So you would go 10 days and then have those tests. I think that one of the challenges right now is the typical PCR test, takes 48 hours. So you're talking about, a lag even to get those 2 tests done and for them to be negative. The other consideration is we know that there are people who shed virus RNA for longer than 10 days, but that RNA is not considered to be something that replicates, so it's not infectious. So the testing strategy, you may find yourself, going out 14, 21 days, even longer to get those 2 negative tests. And we've certainly seen that in some of the studies out of China. So what do you do if someone is sick in the office? You want to designate a room, have them go there with a mask right away, and then, arrange for them, to be transported home, or if they're sick, they may need to be transported to a medical center. The CDC says that if you can leave their area alone for 24 hours, ventilate it as much as possible, and then clean it with disinfecting materials in the same way that you would otherwise, that's best. If not, then wait as long as possible, less than the 24 hours to clean the area. In terms of exposure, the recommendation is that if you've been less than 6 feet apart from a positive or potentially infected employee, less than 6 feet for 15 minutes or greater, then you are considered a contact that should be isolated. If you've been more than 6 feet apart and you haven't spent 15 minutes or more with that employee, then you are not considered a contact that needs to be isolated. So the answer is, if someone's positive, the whole office does not need to quarantine unless they're in a situation where they've been less than 6 feet and more than 15 minutes. The interesting thing too is the 6 feet is 1.8 meters. In most of Europe now, including the UK, they're going to a 1 meter or 1.2 meter standard, so closer together. No one knows what the increased risk of that might be. But I would say, 6 feet is somewhat random, but it seems to work better potentially than a little over 3 feet.
Okay, super. Very interesting. Okay, well, that's good to know that we don't all have to go home if one person shows up positive. I know a lot of people were concerned about that. We certainly hope our attendees won't have to take such steps in any case. So this concludes the prepared question portion of our webinar today. We've had a few questions come through. Dr. Varn, do you have a few more minutes for us?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. So the first question we have is, you've heard once a patient is fever-free for 3 days and are no longer contagious. Is that true? If you've already had COVID-19, can you catch it again? So I think you answered the first part, but the second part, I'm not sure if that was exactly explained.
Yeah, there are people, and these are anecdotal, who end up with symptoms being infected again, but they are the rare exceptions, very rare exceptions. And most of those have been tracked to, the tests were not accurate. They either weren't done right or they were the wrong patient. But there's a very, very small rare subset that get reinfected and actually get really sick, reinfected. But I think you can assume that you can't be reinfected.
Okay, great. The next question we have is if there is any indication that COVID could mutate, like the flu, and has there been other strains which could be more or less deadly?
Yeah, so coronavirus mutates all the time, and they've studied now 30,000 mutations that have happened. Most of the mutations have no significance whatsoever. There's some indication. There was actually a report out of Italy today that a clinician believes that there's been a mutation that's been favorable because they anecdotally are seeing people with this infected who aren't as sick as they were seeing in the beginning. So far, the data hasn't shown that the mutations have been either favorable or unfavorable. They studied H1N1, which was a problem in 2009. And, at that time, studying the mutations was a long, arduous process, but they did discover that over time it mutated to the point where it was not transmissible anymore and not lethal anymore. And that's essentially one of the reasons it burned out that vaccine. So, there is some hope. I think, you got to understand that for a virus to cause a pandemic, it's sort of like the virus won the lottery. It's not common. The mutations that make it both transmittable easily, person to person, and then not too lethal. And the good problem with SARS-1 was that the mortality rate was a lot higher. So it, for better or worse, it burned out its host. It just, people died and they couldn't transmit it because there was no way to transmit it. But in this case, you've got a virus that's 10 times as bad as influenza, but 4 times as likely to be transmitted. That's sort of winning the home run, or winning the lottery. So it would sort of have to win the lottery again to become suddenly, not transmittable, not likely to cause mortality. But there's always hope.
Okay, great. Well, we'll hold on to that hope anyhow. Next question we have is, do we anticipate a second wave to hit the U.S.?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, part of the problem is we're not through the first wave yet, clearly. And, you look at models, they're really kind of 3 different models, and they keep evolving. So, it's kind of like, crystal balling. I got my crystal ball at the store, but maybe I should have gotten the one next to it or the one behind it. I don't know if I have the right crystal ball, and neither do the modelers. But if you look at what they're predicting right now, there are 3 scenarios. One is that that we have this first wave that continues and increases, and then it slowly dies down to a series of small peaks and valleys over time. Second model is that we're sort of through the first wave, or we're, about as through with it as we're going to get, and that in the late fall or early winter, we'll see a surge that will be, markedly higher than what we're seeing now, and that's sort of what happened with the Spanish flu. And then the other is that the third model is that we're going to have these series of outbreaks that cause problems with hospitalizations and mortality, and then we're going to see that decline because some measures are taken to tighten what's happening, like Miami's requiring face masks, California suddenly requiring face masks. Those sort of things will mitigate it, and it'll go down, and then as people relax, it'll come back up, and then we'll mitigate it. So we'll have a series of ups and downs until ultimately we have a vaccine or a therapeutic.
Okay, yeah, that sounds about right. Well, so I guess we all need that crystal ball then.
Yeah, just get the right one.
That's right. So tell me, that we had touched a little bit on international travel and quarantining after international travel. One of our questions is, what about out-of-state travel? Should you still not come into the office for some period of time?
Yeah, right now, domestic quarantine after travel hasn't been required. I think it's a matter of using common sense. If you're coming from an area that has a high level of community-based spread, then I would consider quarantining. If you're coming from an area of less spread or equal spread, then I think it's less of a concern to do so. It's at some point, New York and New Jersey, we're talking about having people quarantine, when they came in, or recommending they quarantine when they leave. But it's actually in those areas, the rate of transmission has fallen significantly. They're less risky than places like South Florida. The other interesting thing, about Florida that you may have heard is that the average age of those who are testing positive is the low 30s. So we're seeing a less at-risk group that are out there, doing what they do socially. So hopefully, in that environment, the at-risk people are protecting themselves, because we worry about, as it spreads, that those younger people will go home to their older parents or friends, and that's really the problem. Understood.
Our next question is regarding the reopening of schools in the fall. Do we think that's going to happen? What are the mile markers we're going to have to meet in order for that to happen?
Yeah, I think that's going to be, even district specific. The CDC has put out guidelines, which are, smaller groups that have a teacher. They don't mix the groups. You eat lunch at your desk. The desks all face forward. To the extent possible, you have children over the age of 10 wear masks. You try to keep them socially distanced. Having a 9-year-old daughter, it's kind of easy to hear that and kind of easy to laugh at it. Some of these restrictions are going to be, impossible. We do know that, from some of the studies that have been done, that in the schools, the problem, the transmission, as well as the injury to the children is very low. It's really the workers, the teachers, and those maintaining the buildings and so forth that are at risk. It's not the kids. So I think jurisdictions are going to decide individually, and I'm not sure anyone really has the right answer. Certainly schools in Europe have opened, schools in Japan have opened. They've, in some cases, closed back down because of an outbreak. There's a lot still to learn about this.
Yeah, understood. So our next question is about in-office cleaning. Do you recommend cleaning procedures between employees in the kitchen areas, between those having lunch, or even employees using the restroom?
Yeah, I think certainly those are now, those are shared areas, and there should be cleaning supplies, and the recommendation should be that they clean, that common surface before and after use. And the same is true of a restroom. We're going to limit the number of people who can be in the area at one time so that they can socially distance, but also, if you're preparing something on a counter, it's just, being a good citizen for your fellow employee to clean before and after so that you know that you're doing your part to limit the exposure.
Yeah, that makes sense. And everybody should be a little more aware of their responsibility in the office for sure. So the next question here is, what are the prospects for therapeutic remedies to treat the virus and the timing around a potential effective vaccine? This may require a crystal ball again, but if you have any insight on that.
Yeah, so therapeutics, there's been a lot of progress very quickly, in the medical science world. Remdesivir, which is an intravenous drug for people who are sick, has been shown to be effective and reduce mortality and morbidity, and that's being used very commonly now. There is an oral sort of cousin to that drug that was just approved for use in India, so it's a pill. It's very little evidence to support that it helps or hurts, but they've approved it and it's out there. There are a lot of studies using what's called convalescent plasma. So you take someone who has been infected and recovered and has antibodies, you take their plasma and you infuse it into people with the same blood type, and those antibodies help them recover faster. And the early data supports that that's working. It's just a matter of having enough people donate to be able to provide it more universally. There's another therapeutic called monoclonal antibodies. So it's sort of the same principle. You're taking the spike protein characteristics in a lab, creating an antibody. Those are just being tested, but if they work, it's just a matter of the expense and manufacturing enough of these monoclonal antibodies to be able to treat people. Dexamethasone was just shown in people who are ventilated or on oxygen to reduce mortality by 40%. And dexamethasone is a common, widely available, dirt cheap steroid that's used all the time. It doesn't work in people who are less sick, but it does work in people who are sick. And then finally, vaccines. A lot of excitement here. There are 10 vaccines in various places that are in human trials now. And there were three that are the furthest along. One is from Moderna. It was tested first in 45 patients in Seattle. In a phase 1, it's now moved to phase 2. And the interesting thing is each, Moderna, but others are partnering with drug manufacturers. So, and they're planning the phase 2 studies while the phase 1 studies are going on, and then the phase 3 at the same time. So they're very quickly taking a process that would normally take years. They're just accelerating by being ready for the next phase. And as soon as they have data that's positive, the FDA is allowing them to move forward. At the same time, in about 3 different vaccines, there are manufacturers already beginning to produce, millions, if not hundreds of millions of doses, just with the idea that if this works, they're going to be ready to widely distribute it. And that's really, it's really exciting in that we could have more than one vaccine that's effective, and it could be available much sooner than the 12 to 18 months that everyone said it would take. The challenge is going to be, when you get to phase 3 studies, maybe you've now treated 3,000 or so people, generally you would wait a year at least to see what the side effect profile was, how long it lasts, whether it works in older, younger people, whether the FDA will allow it to move forward, whether we'll be willing to risk what risks there might be, or, it's hard to know, but at least for those who have more of a problem with getting infected, I predict that by the end of the year, we'll have something available for them to use.
Oh, that would be amazing,
Right.
especially for those high-risk people. Excellent.
Yeah.
So we had a question that kind of piggybacks with it, asking if we've seen the death rate fall as the therapeutics are being used more widely.
I don't think, the impact across the whole universe of infected patients just isn't enough to, move that larger needle. Certainly in the studies, which have been published ones, maybe a couple hundred people. There are now studies with remdesivir that involve thousands of people. In those studies, we've seen the mortality rate go down. But, it's not going to drive the needle on the larger population until we have more availability.
Okay, very good. I just want to invite everybody, your last chance to enter your questions into that Q&A button at the top. We're just about wrapped up here. Our final question is it safe to ride an elevator with other people?
Yeah, again, the recommendation is it's 6 feet apart, so it's going to obviously limit elevators considerably if you maintain that distance. Certainly should be wearing a mask. Not a bad idea to wash your hands or use sanitizer. Once you're out of the elevator, maybe once you're in your office, first thing you should do is wash your hands or use hand sanitizer.
Okay, perfect. Well, that makes it a little more livable. All right, so it looks like bring our webinar for today to a close. We hope you found our Q&A insightful and helpful for getting your workforce back into the workplace. We invite you to continue to use our webinar email address at webinar@princetonlongevity.info should you come up with any additional questions, or if you have interest in learning more about Princeton Longevity Center's Executive Health Program or PinnacleCare's Health Advisory or COVID Response Program. On behalf of Dr. Varn and myself, we thank you for joining us today, and be well.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Andrea.
Thank you.